Welcome back. So last time we dug deep into the struggle over the working day, right? That was all about Chapter 10. Today, we're taking the very next step into Chapter 11 of Marx's Capital. And this is where the focus really shifts. After establishing how capitalists try to extend the working day, Marx now gets into the nitty-gritty, the quantitative side of things. He's asking, what determines the total amount, the sheer mass of surplus value a capitalist can actually walk away with?
Here's our game plan. We're going to build this model piece by piece. First, we'll quickly recap the basic components of a commodity's value. From there, we'll make a really crucial distinction between the rate of surplus value and the mass of it. Then, to make it all concrete, we'll walk through a numerical example that Marx himself lays out. And finally, we'll see how this whole process leads to what he famously called the reserve army of labor.
All right, so first things first. Before we can really grasp the engine of accumulation, we have to understand its moving parts. For Marx, the value baked into any product you see on a shelf is made up of three key elements. Let's break them down.
First up, we have what Marx calls constant capital, which he just labels with a C. Now, this is the value of all the non-human stuff that goes into production. The raw materials, the factory, the machinery. You can think of it as dead labor, value that was created in the past. Its value is essential for sure, but it's just preserved and passed along to the final product. It doesn't grow or create anything new in the process. It just reappears.
The second component, and this is really the star of the show, is variable capital, or V. This is the slice of capital that the capitalist spends on wages, the money used to buy a worker's ability to work, their labor power. Marx calls this living labor for a very specific reason. It's the one and only commodity that has this almost magical ability to create more value than it costs. It doesn't just reproduce its own value, it generates an extra bit, an excess.
And that excess, that extra bit, is our third piece, surplus value, or S. This is the value that the worker creates after they've already created enough value to cover their own wages. It's the product of what Marx calls unpaid labor time. And let's be clear, for Marx, getting this surplus value isn't just a nice bonus. It is the absolute fundamental driving force behind the whole system of capitalist production.
Okay, so we have our building blocks, C, V, and S. Constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. Now we can start putting them together to see how they work. Let's tackle our first big concept. How does Marx propose we actually measure the intensity of this value extraction from a worker?
He gives us a very precise formula for this. The rate of surplus value is simply S divided by V. So surplus value over variable capital. This isn't just about a feeling of being ripped off. In Marx's framework, it's a cold, hard mathematical ratio. It tells you exactly how much unpaid labor time, S, is being pumped out of a worker relative to their paid labor time, V. This ratio is its scientific measure for the degree of exploitation.
But here's the thing. An individual capitalist running a business, well, they're not just obsessed with the rate of exploitation for a single employee. What they really care about is the total aggregate amount of surplus value they can get from their entire workforce. And that brings us to the central point of this whole chapter. So you absolutely have to get this distinction between the rate and the mass. The rate, that's little s over little v, tells us about the intensity, how much is being squeezed from each worker. But the mass, which Marx calls big S, is the total volume, the whole pile of surplus value the capitalist gets at the end of the day. One is about intensity, the other is about quantity, and that difference is everything.
This formula right here really captures the core argument. The total mass of surplus value, S, depends on two key factors you can adjust. It's the rate of surplus value, S over V, multiplied by the total amount of variable capital you've invested, V, which is basically your total wage bill, a stand-in for the number of workers you've hired. These are the two levers a capitalist can pull to crank up their total profit.
I know, this can feel a bit abstract with all the letters and formulas, so let's make it real. We're going to use a numerical example that Marx himself walks through to show how this logic plays out in a practical business decision.
Okay, check this out. Imagine a capitalist has £500 to invest. At first, they spend £200 on materials and machines, that's their constant capital, and £300 on wages, hiring 300 workers. But then they decide to invest in some fancy new machinery. The total capital is still £500, but look how the composition changes. Now £400 goes to the machines, and only £100 is left for wages. And the immediate result? They can only employ 100 workers. 2/3 of the workforce just got fired.
This creates a massive problem for the capitalist, a real contradiction. They've introduced new tech to be more efficient,
But in doing so, they've just gutted the very source of their surplus value, living labor. The number of workers has been slashed by 2/3. So the million-dollar question is, how on earth can they maintain their total profit, let alone increase it?
To get out of this jam, the capitalists can go back to those two levers in our formula. First, they can pull the rate lever. They can make the 100 workers they have left work longer hours or speed up the pace of production. Anything to increase S relative to V. Or, second, they can pull the total variable capital lever. This means they have to accumulate profits, save up, and reinvest to grow the entire business, which would eventually let them hire more workers. And right here, you see that second strategy in action. The capitalist takes their profits, accumulates, and reinvests, growing their total capital from 500 pounds all the way to 1,500 pounds. Now notice the proportion of capital spent on wages is still low, just 1/5. But because the whole pie is 3 times bigger, the absolute amount they spend on wages is back up to 300 pounds. And with that, they can rehire the 200 workers they fired. The mass of labor power is restored, and so is the potential for a large mass of surplus value.
Now, here's where it gets really profound. When you take this single capitalist's dilemma, this dynamic of firing workers for machines, then accumulating to hire them back, and you scale it up across the whole economy, Marx argues it creates a defining systemic feature of capitalism.
As Marx puts it so powerfully here, this isn't just some unfortunate accident or a bug in the system, it's a feature. The overwork of the people who do have jobs is directly linked to the enforced idleness of those who don't. This dynamic actually becomes a tool, a means for enriching capitalists.
This whole cycle creates what Marx famously dubbed the Industrial Reserve Army, or a relative surplus population. And this isn't just another word for unemployment, it's a constantly fluctuating pool of available labor. Technology throws people into this reserve army, which then puts downward pressure on the wages of the employed. And this army serves a crucial function for capital. It provides a ready supply of workers to be absorbed during economic booms and expansions. It basically acts as a regulator, ensuring the labor market always serves the needs of accumulation.
And this leads us to a central, fascinating contradiction that Marx lays bare. The relentless strive for more profit pushes capitalists to adopt technology that sheds labor. But, as we've established, living labor is the one and only source of the surplus value that they're after. So what we see is this perpetual motion machine, a system that is constantly revolutionizing how we produce things, but in doing so is also constantly chipping away at the very foundation from which its profits are generated. It leaves you wondering, is the system perpetually chasing its own tail?